Tonight is the last night that you ever have to hear me this year. But you were really excited for just a second, weren't you? All right. Tonight I want to talk about the man who wouldn't be king. The man who wanted to be king, almost became king, but ended up not becoming king. And we're going to talk about a guy who thought he should be king, but things didn't turn out the way he wanted. Let me start off by telling you about the luckiest man who ever ran for president, who's believed to be the luckiest man who ever ran for president. He won the presidency with just 39% of the votes recorded. He won with just 39%. He's considered the luckiest man who ever won the presidency. How did somebody win with only just under 40% of the votes? How did somebody ever win being president then? You got any ideas?
Somebody dropped out.
Kind of close. There were multiple people running. There were actually 4 people running that year, which does not happen very often in presidential elections because it's so hard to win that way. There's usually just 2 people really at the top. But 4 people were running that year, and the winner got 40%. And so when Abraham Lincoln became president, most of the country did not want him to be president. He just barely got in. So he's called the luckiest man. Now, what's maybe more impressive than whenever he won the presidency is whenever he ran in Congress. There were 3 men who wanted to run for this congressional seat in his state. What state was he from? Was it like Indiana or something? I don't remember. Illinois? So there were 3 people, and they all had a pretty good shot. They were all Republicans. They all thought they had a good shot. The other 2 were named Edward Baker and John Hardin. And so since they were all Republicans, they were all friends, they thought, well, let's just make a deal. Whoever wins the Congress seat, they'll just do it for 1 term. And then when their term is up, then the next 2 will run. And whoever wins that one, they'll just take it for 1 term. And then the next guy can just get it the next time. So they said, well, all 3 be congressmen, but we'll just let the voters decide what order, and we'll all just do 1 term. So it was kind of like a gentleman's agreement. It's not the kind of thing that would probably happen today, because you couldn't really trust people. Actually, they weren't even trustworthy back then. So Edward Baker won first, and he kept his word. He only did it the 1 term, and then he didn't run again. So John Hardin and Abraham Lincoln ran the next time, and John Hardin won, and Lincoln lost. So Hardin did his term, but then he didn't keep his word, and he decided, I want to run again. So Abraham Lincoln had to run against him a second time because the guy broke his word. But when they were running, Abraham Lincoln never said anything negative about John Hardin. Even though John Hardin had basically stabbed him in the back, he never said anything negative about his opponent. And people would come up, in the newspaper and say, well, what do you think of John Hardin? They'd say, what do you think about that guy? And Abraham Lincoln would say, well, he's a very talented man. He's very energetic. He's very generous. He would just say nice things about him. And because of that strong character, a bunch of people pressured John Hardin to drop out, and he did. Because they said, well, Lincoln's a really nice guy. He's not even being negative, and all you're always doing is running him down. So they actually looked at Lincoln's attitude and said, well, we want you to be our next congressman. So they got this other guy to drop out. So anyway, it just shows, when you have good character, it can work out. That kind of thing doesn't happen a lot today. Nowadays, everyone just blasts their opponents and just wants to say every negative thing about them, make them look bad. Nobody would probably do that today either. But when Lincoln ran for president, he was not that popular. He won with almost everybody, 60% of people against him. So not something you'd want to go into the office. You wouldn't want to win the presidency and have half the country already not like you as much. But that's what happened. So he was not popular when he first became president. He's very popular today. David's son, Absalom. We talked about Absalom 3 weeks ago, and then we haven't met since then, but we started Absalom's story. And David's son, Absalom, was very, very popular. I mean, if Israel had votes, if they were like doing what we do and voting for their king, he would have won in a landslide. He was super popular with the people. And if you guys remember, the way he got popular is that he would run his dad down. He would run down King David, and people would be walking into the city. And as they were walking in, Absalom would say, oh, David doesn't care about your problems. Man, if I was king, I would sure take care of your problems. And that's what he was telling people. He was just making up lies to make his dad look bad. But he was doing it so everybody would want to join up with him. So he starts leading this rebellion against David and sets himself up to be king and runs David out of Jerusalem. And so now David's going around and getting his army built up so he can come back and take the kingdom back away from his son. And so that's what's been going on in the story. So tonight, it's about what happened to Absalom and how his story kind of ended up. Absalom got enough people to follow him that he was leading this really successful rebellion, and he also kicked out Joab. Joab is this guy we've been following through the book of 2 Samuel. Joab was David's commander of his armies, and Absalom kicked Joab out of the kingdom too and set up a different guy. So Joab also doesn't like Absalom very much. Now, if you don't remember what we said about Absalom before, there was a description given of him. Not many people in the Bible get a physical description, but Absalom did. Said, in all Israel there was not a man so highly praised as Absalom. From the top of his head to the sole of his foot there was no blemish in him. Whenever he cut the hair of his head, he used to cut his hair once a year because it became too heavy for him. And he would weigh it, and its weight was 200 shekels by the royal standard. So we talked about that a few weeks ago, and how there's really only one way to get your hair to weigh that much. And we talked about doing this thing called dreadlocks, and people did it back then. And they think that's probably what he did. And they had some way, I don't know how people make that with their hair. I don't know how that's done, but that's probably what he did to make his hair weigh so much every year. And so that's what Absalom had. And I think Samson also did that. But anyway, that's beside the point. So that was Absalom, and there's just a lot about his hair that comes up in the story. And so that's why I bring that to your attention again. But then in 2 Samuel 17, it says, Absalom had appointed Amasa over the army in the place of Joab. And so I won't read the rest of it, but so basically Joab has been kicked out of the kingdom too. So Joab does not like Absalom. And that's kind of who we're following more as Joab. So that's why I bring that up. Okay, so here's what happened to Absalom. In chapter 18, it says, David mustered the men who were with him and appointed over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. David sent out his troops, a third under the command of Joab, a third under Joab's brother Abishai, and a third under Ittai. I'm not sure how to say it. But basically it's saying they divided all their armies up into three parts to go into this battle. And it says, the king told the troops, I myself will surely march out with you. But the men said, well, you must not go out. If we're forced to flee, they won't care about us, but you are worth 10,000 of us, and it would be better now for you to give us support from the city. So David's like, well, I'm going to go into battle with you guys. I'm going to lead you all in battle. And they're saying, David, the whole thing's about you. Like, if you go into the battle and you get killed, then all of this fighting has been for nothing. So we can't put you out there in the battle. And they said, you need to stay back home so that doesn't happen. Because, if he dies out there, all they're fighting, all they're dying, it doesn't mean anything then. So the king answered, that's David, he said, I will do whatever seems best to you. So the king stood beside the gate while all the men marched out in units of hundreds and of thousands. And the king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, be generous with the young man Absalom for my sake. And all the troops heard the king giving orders concerning Absalom to each of the commanders. So when David is saying, be generous to Absalom, what he's really saying is, go out there and do the battle, but if you catch Absalom, don't kill him, because he's still my son, and I just don't want him to end up dead. And so David, even though his son's done all these terrible things to him, David still really loves his son and he doesn't want his son to die. And so he's angry at Absalom, but he's not wishing Absalom's death. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense from the military standpoint, because if you think about it, there's all these people who are going to go out. I think it says 20,000 people die in the battle. So all these people die, but David's saying, but the guy who's causing all this battle and death, he should get to live. That's what David's saying. So it doesn't really make sense from a military standpoint, but it's just because David had this soft spot toward his son that he really wasn't doing what needed to be done. So he says, don't kill my son. And all the troops heard the king giving orders concerning Absalom. So everybody knew this rule. Okay, it says in the next verse, and if you can't read it there, I think it's in your bulletin too. It says, now Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule, and as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's hair got caught in the tree, and he was left hanging in midair while the mule he was riding kept on going. So, it's easy to imagine what happened. He's riding the mule under, his hair gets stuck in it, and he's hanging from the tree, and the mule just keeps going running and doesn't realize that he's gone, that he's not on him anymore. So he's just hanging there from the tree, and he's trapped because his hair's all tangled up in there. So the moral of the story is, guys, keep your hair short. And that's not really the moral of the story, but it might not be a bad idea. when I think about hair, actually, that's a soft spot for me right now, because at Christmas Eve, we were at Emily's grandparents' house, and Jesse's sitting somewhere across the room, and I had my head turned, and she's like, "Look at the back of Luke's head," and I had a gray hair in the back of my head. It wasn't just. Well, the bald spot, I just combed it bad probably. But anyway, there's no bald spot. But there was a gray hair. There actually was, and they took pictures and showed me, and I was depressed. And then Emily calmed me down and was like, "No, Luke, you don't have a gray hair. It was just the light shining on it weird." And I believed her. And then we're at my parents' house the next night, and I was telling my grandma about it, and I'm like, "But Emily said there's not really gray hair." And she looked, and she's like, "There is a gray hair there." And my mom's like, she's over somewhere else, and she's like, "I can see it from here." And I'm like, "Mom." Now that means she's old if her son has gray hair. But anyway, so I'm in like my own personal crisis with hair right now. But I don't think so. That's what's weird. It's not fair.
I had a gray hair yesterday.
Really? It gets to all of us. It's at some point. You guys are next. So anyway. Okay, so hair, or whatever I was talking about. Let me see where I am in here. What? Oh, thank you. I'm not going to tie it in the middle of a sermon. I'll just keep my feet apart. Okay, so wherever we are, when one of the men saw what had happened, and so he sees that Absalom's hanging from a tree by his hair, probably really painful. It says, when one of the men saw what had happened, he told Joab, "I just saw Absalom hanging." I can't talk. He said, "I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree." And you think about it, it's almost kind of funny because like they're fighting this big battle all about this guy Absalom, and he's just hanging over in a tree. Someone just stumbles across and like, that's the guy we're all fighting about. So it's almost kind of funny when you think of it. And I think it's funny, it just has like a period. I mean, I think there's probably like an exclamation point there when the guy was actually saying it. It's like, "I just saw the guy hanging in an oak tree." So Joab said to the man who told him this, "What? You saw him? Well, why didn't you strike him to the ground right there? Then I would have to give you 10 shekels of silver and a warrior's belt." So we know why the guy didn't strike him down, but Joab's like, "Well, why didn't you just kill him right there? This all would have been over." And that really does make sense from, a military standpoint. Yeah.
What is a warrior's belt?
I don't know, but the way I heard it described when I was studying stuff, I mean, it'd be like, well, nowadays when someone wins a wrestling championship, they get a big belt, or maybe like a big belt buckle to strut around with, like, "I'm the one who killed Absalom." That's how I heard it described, but I'm not sure exactly. But anyway, he's saying, "I would have rewarded you a bunch if you had just killed Absalom right there." Joab is like not understanding why this guy didn't kill Absalom right there. Now we know why the guy didn't, because David had said to everybody, "Well, don't kill him." And so he was saying, "I just followed David's orders." And he says here in the next verse, the man replied, "Even if 1,000 shekels were weighed out into my hands, I would not lay a hand on the king's son. In our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, protect the young man Absalom for my sake." So this was a good man, because he's saying, if you'd offered me all this money to defy the king's orders, I still wouldn't have done it. That's what he's saying. He's like, there's no way I would have disobeyed the king. And that's just a good lesson for us that, our morality, doing the right thing, that shouldn't be something that people can just buy from us or say, well, would you do something wrong if I offered you this much money, And that kind of situation can come up in life where maybe a boss, he can say, I want you to do this. It might be unethical, but I want you to do this or that. And you're like, well, I'm not going to do that. And he says, okay, well, I'll give you a bonus this week. I'll give you a raise. Then it becomes more tempting to do maybe something unethical or what he wanted you to do. But our morality shouldn't be something people can just buy off. And so this was a good man. Well, Joab is not such a good man. And so it says in the next verse, he says, "I'm not going to wait like this for you," which I think he's just saying, like, I don't have time for this, blowing him off. It says he took 3 javelins in his hand and plunged them into Absalom's heart while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree. And 10 of Joab's armor bearers surrounded Absalom, struck him and killed him. Then Joab sounded the trumpet, and the troops stopped pursuing Israel, for Joab halted them. They took Absalom, threw him into a big pit in the forest, piled up a heap of rocks over him, and meanwhile, all the Israelites fled to their homes. So they fled to their homes because then it's like they didn't look like they were part of the whole rebellion against David, because now Absalom's dead, so they just ran home. And then like if a soldier comes by and knocks on the door, he says, hey, were you part of Absalom's rebellion? Then you'd be like, well, no, I was here at home. I was just watching it on CNN. I wasn't a part of it at all. And they could get out of trouble then. So that was probably why they ran home. But we see here with Joab, it's his big character flaw that almost always comes up with his stories. He always thinks that he knows better than David. He's supposed to serve David, but he will often do the wrong thing and disobey David because he thinks that he knows what's best. Oh, I don't think David should go into business with, I forgot his name, the guy who had killed his brother. So he's like, I don't think David should be in business with this guy. I'm just going to kill him. That's the kind of stuff Joab would do. So right here, he's like, well, David would be better off if Absalom was just dead instead of just in a prison cell or getting to be free again or pardoned. He says he should just be dead. So Absalom always just takes things into his own hands, and that's what he did here. And then the story has one last comment, and it's kind of the end of Absalom's little story, but I think it's what I want to focus us on tonight. So it says, during his lifetime, Absalom had taken a pillar and erected it in the king's valley as a monument to himself, for he thought, I have no son to carry on the memory of my name. And he named the pillar after himself, as it is called Absalom's monument to his day. And so his big legacy is to himself. He built his own monument and just built it to himself. And, monuments, people today get monuments built to them, like the Washington Monument or the Lincoln Memorial, but those guys didn't build it for themselves. Other people came along and said, oh, these were great men, we'll build monuments for them. But Absalom just built it for himself. And it's kind of pathetic whenever you think of it that way. But it's called Absalom's monument, and it said that it still sits there to this day. And that means the day that this was written, 2 Samuel, but it's actually still there to this day. You could actually go, if you went to Israel, you could go to Absalom's monument. And I heard that the Orthodox Jews there, that means like the Jews who believe the Bible, that it's true, they really don't like Absalom. So when they walk by Absalom's monument, they'll spit on it every time they walk by. It's just like the custom that you do in Israel. So people still don't like Absalom very much today, but it's actually still there. So the thought I want to leave us with tonight on the subject of like memorials and monuments, I want to talk about leaving a legacy. Ask yourself, what will my legacy be? Now, that's not a subject that you often talk about with teenagers, because what is a legacy? A legacy is basically like, what I'll be remembered for. And usually when people talk about it, it's after they die. It's like, what's going to be left behind after I die? Like, will I leave good things behind? Will I leave bad things behind? Okay, it's probably too short for any of us to be thinking about dying and writing a will and all that kind of stuff. It's too soon. I hope none of us die. I hope that we all go in the rapture and that we never die. But I'm not really talking about when we die tonight. Think about what do you want people to think about you at the stage you're in right now in life? What do you want people to remember about you after you graduate high school? Because a lot of you guys are in high school now and you have friends, you have reputations. And think about, what do you want people to remember about you 20 years from now, 30 years from now, at this stage that you're at in your life? What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind right there? What kind of reputation do you want people to have of you? What kind of things do you want people to say about you when they remember who you were at this time in your life? That's the kind of thing to think about tonight. That's kind of the main idea. A reputation, it's a really hard thing to shake, especially like a bad reputation. People, if they get a bad reputation, it can be hard for them to ever lose that. Even like 20 years later, 30 years later, people will still remember that about them. Think about like first impressions. Have you ever met somebody and just thought, oh man, that guy was a jerk, or he was a loudmouth? Well, no matter what he ever does to try to change it, we'll still probably think of him as a jerk and a loudmouth because that was our first impression. You guys probably heard the saying, you can't make a second first impression, because that's so powerful what people first think. So you always want to make good first impressions, and you always want to live a life that when people think back on you, they think good things about you instead of, if they thought you were a liar or a jerk or whatever. Because what you'll find out is that 10 or 20 years from now, you might meet somebody who knew you today, and their impression of you is most likely still going to be, they're going to think the same thing about you that they thought of you today. They're not going to think, oh, well, maybe he's changed. Maybe they got better in this area or that area. They're really just probably going to think that you're exactly the same, because that's how people are. That's just how it goes. Most of the time, people don't think, oh, they've probably changed since then. So think about what you want people to say about you. Do you want them to say, oh, they always told the truth? Sometimes it was really annoying how honest they always were all the time. Is that what you want people to say? That would be a good thing, I think. Or, so-and-so, they always treated people kindly. They always treated people with fairness. Oh, I remember so-and-so. They were always in a good mood. That's the kind of thing you want people to say. You don't want to have a reputation where people are like, oh, man, they were hilarious when they were drunk. That would not be a good reputation, and that would be what would stick with people for a long time. So you don't want that to be your reputation. So just think about that. That's just kind of my big idea for tonight, is what will my legacy be? You don't want to have one like Absalom, who just built a monument to himself, and to this day people spit on his grave or on his monument because they hated him so much. That would be a bad legacy. So think about, you're in high school now, and you'll be in college, and you'll start jobs, and you'll get chances to make a fresh start. So think about those two. What kind of first impression do I want to make when I'm in college with people, or at my first job, or my next job? You get these new chances to make a fresh start, and just think about what do you want to put out there for people to remember you by? How do you want people to know you? And so that's the main idea for tonight. The last thought, Absalom was an accepted king, and he hung suspended on a tree between heaven and earth. Absalom was an accepted king, and he hung suspended on a tree between heaven and earth. Jesus was a rejected king, and he hung suspended on a tree between heaven and earth. Jesus did the same thing, except Absalom was accepted, and Jesus was rejected. And there's this line that comes up in the Old Testament, and they would say, well, cursed is he who hangs on a tree. That's what people would say, and it's like a weird... when I hear that, I'm like, well, of course they're cursed. They're hanging from a tree. They're either dead or they're dying, But there's this line that would just keep coming up. Cursed is he who hangs from a tree. And that's what the Jews would say. And maybe you'd think, oh, well, that must be a prophecy about Absalom because he died hanging in a tree. But it's not until we get to the New Testament we see Jesus. And Jesus also hung from a tree. And that might be weird to us. We say, well, he was on a cross. It was beams of wood. We might not call it a tree. That's what the Jews thought of it. They would say about Jesus that he hung on a tree. That's how Paul would write about it. And Paul would say he was cursed when he hung on the tree. We say, what does it mean that he was cursed? It means Jesus became a curse for us. Jesus took on our sin. It says in Isaiah, he became sin who knew no sin, that we might become the righteousness of God. So Jesus took all of our sin and he hung on the tree between heaven and earth. He made the way between heaven and earth. And that's what, Absalom did it. He hung on the tree, but when Jesus did it, it would actually accomplish something. He accomplished our salvation. So that's the thought I want to leave us with tonight. First, the Jews killed their Messiah. But then Steve Harvey said that Jesus was actually the real king the whole time.